I am Ula Brenna's daughter, and I'm joined here by Dam Kinehild and Baron Bersi, which is always a tongue twister for me. Today, so back to introductions, which Bersi and I just had a discussion about and how terrible we are with introductions. Like I said, I am Ula, and I am a Norse saga enthusiast and idiot. So I rely heavily on Bersi and Kinehild to correct me and to train me in the proper ways. Mostly I just like to read silly sayings. And today we are going to be talking about the Havamal, which is probably one of the most well-renowned Norse sagas, Norse tales. And Kinehild is going to talk about the Old English Maxims, which Bersi and I know nothing about, so that will be exciting for all of us. Bersi,
So
sorry. Kinehild, you can introduce yourself, whoever.
My name is Dam Kinehild, the library. I am a Old English fan in a big way. I have a degree in linguistics from the University of Iowa, specializing in the history of English. So when I was 19, I got a little nutty about dead languages, and that never went away. So here I am now talking about it with two of my favorite people in the world.
My name is Bersi Edvardason. I'm from the West Kingdom. I am less than a week away from getting a degree in Scandinavian studies from UC Berkeley. And my focus in that is Old Norse. So I study the sagas, literature, and language. Absolutely got hooked on dead languages as well. Something about zombies speaking really intrigues me. And I'm excited to talk about Gnomic Poetry.
I'm so bummed I don't have a gnome hat. Seriously, I'm known for hats, and I don't have a gnome hat. I gotta fix that problem.
I made this special this morning. It's neon yellow on the inside because that was the stuff that I had.
Even better. I spent my morning making sure that there wasn't a dog fight in my house, so that was my goal.
That's important. So go ahead, go for it, Bersi.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about the Havamal first. So Havamal, that means the speech of the high one. Mol means speech. Hov or hovi is a Haiti, kind of a kenning, but a little shorter. That refers to Odin all the time, most of the time. So it just means high. So in this case, it's being used as a noun. It's the high one. It's our manuscript for this poem comes from the Codex Regius, which is a very big name, famous manuscript. Paleographically and linguistically, we can date the penning of this manuscript to Iceland, circa 1270. But it's clear that these poems that are found in it that comprise the Poetic Edda are much older, passed down through oral tradition, although we cannot tell exactly how old for any of these. The meter is Ljóðaháttr, which is the typical meter for this kind of Gnostic poetry, this wisdom verse. The poem is many stanzas long. I think it is 163 stanzas. And it kind of has some strange, it'll bounce back and forth between Ljóðaháttr and Galdralog and some other sort of meters. We won't get into that. And the structure also is a little strange. It's clear that the Codex Regius was not the first time it was recorded in a manuscript, because there's a lot of mistakes and strange word swaps. But basically the overall structure is the first 79, 80 strophes or so are the gnomic verses, and Kinehild and I will be talking about what that entails a little later. A brief departure from that, where Odin recounts his adventure, two different love adventures with Villingar and Gunnlod. And then there's a section that has to do with it's the Lord Fofnir portion, where Odin seems to be speaking to a man who we have really no idea who he is. He doesn't show up anywhere outside of this poem, called Lofofnir, giving him specific advice. Then a brief account of how Odin discovered the runes, and some magic spells that the speaker knows. It's unclear if the speaker is supposed to be Odin all the way throughout, but there are definite sections where it is supposed to be Odin speaking, hence speech of the High One. In that first part, of course, which we're going to be focusing on, the Gnostic poetry portion, it's sort of set up as you are advice for a traveler who is going to be a guest in someone else's home. Of course, there are things that a good host should do, and lots of different tales and stories deal with that. But this section deals with what you're supposed to do as a guest. And Ula, you pulled some verses from this section.
I did. So some of the verses that amused me for whatever reason this morning when I didn't have enough coffee yet. So wisdom for wanderers and counsels to guests. So verse 6, let no man glory in the greatness of his mind, but rather keep watch over his wits. Cautious and silent, let him enter a dwelling. To the heedful comes seldom harm, for none can find a more faithful friend than the wealth of mother wit. One of the things that I loved about that is it's just, keep a watch over your wits. Just be cautious, be kind when you're entering a dwelling that's not yours. Verse 12, less good than they say for the sons of man is the drink oft of ale. For the more they drink, the less they can think and keep watch over their wits. So again, we're watching over our wits, but don't be a drunk idiot. Verse 75 is probably the best known one. It's very common to be seen, and it's cattle die and kinsmen die. Thyself soon too must die. But one thing never will, but one thing never will die. I can't read today. Fair fame of one who has earned. So everything dies, but your legend will live on forever. Make sure it's a good one. Mm-hmm. So those were the things that I pulled out from the wisdom for wanderers. And there are so many of them. So many. It's really actually hard to choose some good ones.
I chose a couple that are, it's still sort of in that segment, but that have to deal with friendship as well, and also about traveling and how to deal with friends in that sense, that I really liked. For instance, verse 34, it is a great detour to a bad friend's house, even though he lives on the route. But to a good friend's house, the ways lie straight, even though he lives far off. Mm-hmm. I really like this idea that the road is always good to a good friend. And 43, to his friend, a man should be a friend, and to his friend's friend too. But no man should be a friend to the friend of his enemy. I have definitely heard this before.
Right?
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
And yep.
And 44, right afterwards, gives a little more advice on how to maintain a good friendship. If you've a friend whom you really trust and from whom you want nothing but good, you should mix your soul with his and exchange gifts and go and see him often. It really hones in on the point that gift giving, gift exchanging, and visiting, and part of visiting isn't just, oh, I'm seeing my friends, but actually the services of being, the dynamic of being a guest and a host is a sign of friendship. The giving of a feast because someone has come into your home, and then the guest being a good guest and maybe giving gifts in return. solidifies friendships, not just in the sense that we have today of like, I'm a friend of somebody, but also sort of allyship and possibly like maybe they'll support you in a legal case later. Or if someone's attacking your farm, you might be able to trust them to help defend it. So this kind of gift giving and stuff is very important for your safety as well as just happiness.
I think so. I at some point in the future, I'd like to get in a little bit more on the gift giving thing. There are 2 other stanzas in the Havamal that talk about gift giving, 42 and 48, and they both talk about gifts for the reciprocal nature of gifts. And there's some really cool anthropology that talks about gift giving cultures and how you how that establishes sort of societal contact or not contacts, sort of structure is it's all about the sort of reciprocal nature of this gift giving, which I think the Havamal really stresses is important. Like when you get a gift, you should return it with a gift. The balance has to be maintained. So that was my little nutty. I'll let you get back to your.
I love it. As Bersi said, it's the Havamal is broken up into different sections. There's also Odin's love quests, and that's, I don't know, what, 12 verses or something like that. I love this one. Many a sweet maid, when one knows her mind, is fickle found towards men. I proved it well when that prudent lass I sought to lead astray. Shrewd maid, she sought me with every insult, and I won therewith no wife. So woo as he could, Odin didn't get any play that night, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then just a few verses later, in a different section of the Counseling of the Stray Singer, wounded to death have I seen a man by the words of an evil woman. A lying tongue had bereft him of life, and all without reason of right. So Odin is a known, he gets around a little bit. Philanderer, but clearly there are times where he just can't get any play, and that amused me. Again, pre-coffee this morning.
So I would like you to know that in those particular moments, I'm imagining Anthony Hopkins, full Marvel Odin, like, hey, no, not touching it.
One of the interesting things about those love quests, because they seem kind of like, this isn't advice, this doesn't have to do with anything, is for instance, in one of them, it comes right after, there's a reference to it, and then it pops up, the full story comes up in a few verses later, right after they talk about moderation in drinking, and you shouldn't drink too much, you'll say something dumb. And then Odin comes in and says, like that one time, I was way too drunk, and this is why I couldn't get a woman.
Yeah. So
they're building on each other, and these anecdotes sort of prove the points that the advice is trying to make.
Exactly. It's here's the advice, and here's what happens if you don't follow this advice, right? I love it.
Along the same lines as there's a little advice in this particular list about women. It's a long list. I've taken only just part of it, but I also think it's a good example of how, even in serious poetry, I think they've put in a little humor. So I'm going to let the verse do talking for me. This is verses 85 through 89, but skipping 87 and 88. So, a breaking bow, a burning flame, a gaping wolf, a cawing crow, a grunting pig, a rootless tree, a rising wave, a boiling kettle, a flying dart, a falling wave, ice of one night, a coiled serpent, the bed talk of a woman, or a broken sword, the playing of a bear, or a king's child, a brother's killer if met on the road, a house half burned, a too swift horse, the mount is useless if it breaks a leg. Let no man be so trusting as to trust all these. So coming in right at the end of this long list, you're like, what is going on? What is the connection between all these things?
Right.
Like, don't trust any of that.
Any of this stuff. And, and it all makes sense. A breaking bow, a grunting pig, a rootless tree. A rootless tree is just, that's terrifying. The ice. the ice of one night. I'm not walking on ice that's only been there one night. Like that's just daft.
Included in this list also, I didn't include it here, but a seeress who only tells of good things.
Yep.
Not
things that we can't trust.
Is now a good time for a brief diverging into Old Norse linguistics?
Sure.
When is
Absolutely.
it not a good time?
So this is where it gets a little nerdier. There's a portion of this poem, as I said, they go into this section where Odin is talking to some guy named Lodfofnir, and during this, he tells of how he discovered the runes, and the verses starting at 138 say, "I know that I hung on a windswept tree 9 long nights, wounded with a spear, dedicated to Odin, myself to myself, on that tree of which no man knows from where its roots run," meaning Yggdrasil, the world tree. "With no bread did they refresh me, nor a drink from a horn. Downwards I peered, I took up the runes, screaming I took them, then I fell back from there." And then 141 comes in to say about what happened because of this. "Then I began to quicken and to be wise, to grow and to prosper. One word from another word found a word for me. One deed from another deed found a deed for me." Now those last 2 lines are a little weird. In the Old Norse, this verse is "Honam ek freivask, och froder vera, och vaxa och velhafask. Ord mer att ordi ords leitavi. Verk mer att verki verks leitavi." As you can see, this parallel structure and the repetition of the same words over and over again. Ord mer att ordi ords leitavi. And the word choice here is really interesting to me because I think that the cadence of these lines is beautiful, and the way we've used the same word and verk, verki, verks, or the ords. These are both neuter nouns. Nouns in Old Norse have gender, and they also decline, so they have cases. So what's happening here is each variation of the word, in this case, for instance, ord, meaning word, tells you about what it's doing in the sentence, whether it's the subject or the object or the indirect object or possessive. And at first it is a little confusing because it seems orv is in nominative, ordi is in dative, and that makes sense because dative nominative means it's the subject of the sentence. Dative means it's the indirect object, so that's the af ordi, meaning from the words, right? And then ords, well, that's genitive, and usually that means it's a possessive word, you know, of the word or the words something, right? But because the original author, whoever it may be, chose the word leitavi, which means to seek or to find, that is a verb that uses genitive rather than the normal dative or accusative to refer to the object of the sentence. So I actually wrote, if they had used the word finna, which means find, so the sentence wouldn't have made very much a difference in meaning. The sentence would have sounded more like orð mer af orði orð fundi. So instead of with an S at the end, it's just orð again, and so then you have 2 of the same word in this sentence. And it might cause some confusion over which one is supposed to be the subject. I don't think this would hinder understanding, but I do think it makes the cadence of the sentence sound less strong, because the way it's written now means that the first word has to be the subject, and so it puts emphasis on it rather than, oh, the subject could be the last time it's said. So I just found it really interesting that by using leta, it forced the sentence structure into a really quite pretty cadence.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I found when I was reading through the Havamal, of course, in an English translation, because I don't read Old Norse like you do, is that the structure is sometimes the verses are just, you know, line, and some of them are repetitive, right? But then it'll repeat the first two lines and then have something different for the next two or three, and then, you know, and it's interesting because it starts to for me, it starts to become a little monotonous, but then you're like, hey, wait, what, that's something actually changed there, right? And I just, because I don't read the Old Norse, I suspect that it's probably it's not as monotonous in the Old Norse. I don't know, maybe it is. What I see, the Old Norse, all I see is the Swedish chef going bork, bork, bork. But that's because I'm not a linguist. But it's strange to me, and maybe this is a translation thing, or maybe it's because of, you know, the different manuscripts, because it was first seen in the 10th century and then again in the 13th, and it's kind of cobbled together, that there's different types of sentence structures and different types of rhythm and flow. It just feels sometimes a little bit disjointed for me, but again, not a linguist. It's
absolutely, you're picking up on what's happening. So when you read the sagas, it seems like, oh, this makes sense. The word, you know, the sentences are fairly easy to understand. They don't seem very convoluted, right. Unless you're reading Snorri. His Old Norse is rough to translate. But the poetry is almost like another language. The normal conventions of how you would set up a sentence to be understandable go right out the window because of how strict the meter and the syllable count, the half rhymes,
right. It's almost more. It's more like a haiku than right, and that it's got syllable structure and stuff like that. That I, again, as a novice, I just don't get, right. Yeah, and it can be really convoluted sometimes. But again, I'm digressing here.
3 years. I had to be doing Old Norse for 3 years before I could start to translate poetry. And it took the first verse, 8 lines I tried to translate. Took me 3 hours to translate 8 lines.
Wow.
So it gets a lot more difficult. And at that point, already in 3 hours, I could translate a whole Thotter, you know?
Right.
So our first episode, when one of the poems that we did was a fairly complex one, it was, I think, an hour and a half, 2 hours that Bersi and I spent on Zoom or on Messenger, I don't remember which, with a friend of his, like picking through, trying to translate one word.
One
word, right?
It was a great word, though.
It was. That word's going to be in my head. Tunglu rundum. Like that's going to be there forever. Yeah. But one thing before we move on, one thing that I did kind of want to go back to was you were talking about using the genitive in this direct object kind of position, and I was trying to think if there's an example of it in English that's similar. And off the top of my head, I couldn't come up with an Old English one, but there is a sort of archaic turn of phrase where we use a genitive construction, and that's when we talk about the birth of a child. So if you look at archaic descriptions of, like, especially around royal births, the queen was safely delivered of a child.
Oh yes.
Yes.
Right? And I don't know if that's a similar underlying structure or if that's just something else. And that's I was kind of clicking around but I kind of gave up pretty quickly.
That would be really interesting to see if it's the verb that's ruling a genitive, because that's the case in the Old Norse.
Right. And I know there are some examples of that kind of weirdness in Old English, and Latin also has some examples of that where it's like this verb has to work with a dative or with a genitive, rather than with the standard accusative case. Or in Latin, I can't think off the top of my head of any Latin ones where it's ablative, but it doesn't matter. That's not what this is.
Not Latin.
But there are cases of that, and I'll do some research and I'll see if I find an answer for next time. But I realize that we've been talking about Old Norse poetry, but now I want to talk about Old English poetry.
Absolutely.
I want to hear about Maxims.
I want to know more about Old English poetry. Let's go.
Okay, so I'm not going to talk as much about the structure as Bersi did, mostly because poetic structure is not really my jam. Also because Old English poetic structure is not as formalized as Old Norse poetic structure was. We didn't have the prose edda, which sat down and was like, you shall build your poem in this particular form, you losers. So we were a little more free and loose, as it were, though we were writing shit down earlier, so that's our claim to fame. So there's this poem, it's called Maxims 2. It appears in the Codex Tiberius B1 manuscript, which is a lesser known manuscript. It's in the British Library. It's part of the Cotton Collection. There's not a good firm date on it. And there's Maxims 1 and Maxims 2. Maxims 2 is generally more religious in nature. It was probably copied down by monks because that's who was doing a lot of the copying back in the day, almost all of the copying. And the argument is that its content was influenced by the monks who copied it. So I'm going to burn through as quickly as I can in Old English, and then Ula, if it's okay with you, I'll just do the English as well.
Yep, absolutely.
Let me switch windows. Younger athling shell on Gora Yasithas. Bulden to Beadua on Beachifa, Elan shell on Eola, Ed shell with Helma Hilda Yabindan, Hafok shell on Glofa, Wida Yawunian, Wolf shell on Baroa, Earm on Haga, Eofor shell on Holta, Toth Maganas Trum. Til shell on Evela, Domus Wurkran, Daroth shell on Handa, Gar Golda Fach, Gim shell on Hringa, Standan stay up on Yep, Stream shell on Eutham, Manshan Merafloda, Mashell on Keola, Segelgrud Seomian, Swerod shell on Berma, Drichliche Isern, Draka shell on Hlawa, Frod Fratwitam Wonk, Fish shell on Watera, Kunra Kennen, Kuning shell on Hela Beagus Dalen, Bera shell on Hathith, Eld an Edgesful, Ea of Dun shell, Frograth Ferran, Furd shell Atsomna, Tirfastra Yetrum, Treo shell on Eola, Wisdom on Wera. So unfortunately, none of the fun stuff that I'm going to talk about here in a second actually appears in that segment of the poem. But what that says in English, you probably picked up a few words: draka, dragon, glofa, glove, and then this one's teeth. Kuning, king. So excellent comrades must build up the young noble in battle and the ring giving. The earl must be courageous. The blade must await the helmet in warfare. The wild hawk must abide upon the glove. The wolf must live in the grove, a miserable lone dweller. The boar in the forest, firm in his toothy power. An excellent man, his toothy power. An excellent man must work glory in his homeland. A javelin must rest in the palm, a spear gold splattered. A gem must be in the ring, standing high and wide. The river must mix up with the waves, the tidal flood. A mast must be on the ship, the sail yard hanging. A sword must be in the lap, the lordly iron. The dragon must be in the barrow, aged, proud in treasure. The fish must be in the water, propagating its kind. The king must wait in the hall, dealing in rings. So these are all, this part of the poem, it's not giving advice like Havamal does, but what it's talking about, and it's sort of it's very solidly early Christian concept, is that right order in the world is the most beneficial thing to everybody. Everybody has their place and they should remain in it at all times and not mess with any of this revolutionary nonsense. So it's the order of heaven should be reflected on earth. So you have the king, he must be in his hall, he must do his kingly job. And the atheling, so an atheling is essentially any male in the king's family who is eligible for kingship. So while they did eventually adopt primogeniture at an early stage, the Old English kingdoms, the heptarchy, septarchy, whatever, the seven kingdoms had a Witan, and the Witan selected the king from among this group of athelings. So here the atheling is learning his place in the world. He has to learn to be bold in battle, noble in battle, and be the ring giver, which the king at the end is in the hall giving those rings. So that's him learning his place in the world and then accepting it. So that's kind of really this whole poem is getting into like, these are your roles and these are the roles you must fulfill. The fish have to be in the water. They can't live anywhere else, and they have to do their fishy thing, propagating more fish. That's apparently fish's only job. I really
eat a lot of fish. I would agree.
You know, it's, and it is, well, that's there's I have this whole question about fishing in England. And there is this really cool 14th century manuscript that are the first examples of flies, as in fly fishing, of how to fly a fly. And it's this Middle English manuscript. I've got a translation of it somewhere. But it was like, I've tied some of the flies, and according to Duke Skeggy and Viscountess Militia, they totally seem like they would work, and I trust those two. So what is gnomic poetry? I wanted to talk about that briefly. I know we're a little over time. What I thought was kind of cool is that I found an SCA period reference of sort of poetic, like this guy in the 16th century is talking about what, like, he's a poetry critic. So his name was Henry Peacham. He was an Elizabethan poetry critic, and he defined a gnome, not with the hat, as a saying pertaining to the manners and common practices of men, which declareth with an apt brevity what in this our life ought to be done or not done. So this is a much better description, I think, of Havamal, because Havamal talks about all sorts of things you are supposed to definitely do or not do. And this one is, the Maxims is really more like, this is the life you have to live.
Stating the way it is rather than giving advice on how to be, right? Yeah.
Right.
And there was an interesting article that I found by an author, Descus, which talks about how do you differentiate between a proverb and a gnome. Gnome here, by the way, coming from the Greek word for an opinion. So, and I this is something I meant to look up ahead of time, but I don't know if that shares an etymology with gnome as in a garden gnome.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So I am kind of curious about that. I'm going to be looking that one up pretty quick here, unless you're on it, in which case
I'm on it.
I'm on it.
Okay.
You guys are the best. So he kind of talks about a gnomic verse must be potentially independent, syntactic and semantically. So it must be separable from any other clause or sentence preceding or following it, which I think in some ways the Havamal are. You can take the stanzas of the Havamal out and just have those stanzas. And the same thing with the Maxims is you can just take the fish must be in the water propagating its kind, and it doesn't need the rest of the poem to make sense. It must be general in its reference, so it will take the form of a declarative sentence describing or prescribing a situation or action that occurs more than once. So again, really nice declarative sentence. The fish must be in the water propagating its kind. Nice, easy to translate, unlike the Old Norse poetry, frankly. And then Descus gives the example of you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Is gnomic. It's that nice declarative statement. It doesn't need any other explanation. But I led my horse to water yesterday, but I couldn't make it drink is not, because it's not a general statement that occurs more than once. It's happened in the past. And so I think that's a nice way to kind of differentiate between what is a gnome, what is a garden gnome, and what is a...
As to what is a garden gnome, it's a dwarf-like earth-dwelling spirit, 1712 from French Nome, I don't know French. And from the medieval Latin gnomus, which was a name given to the pygmei or gnomi, to elemental earth beings, possibly from Greek genomos, earth dweller. So not the same.
Not the same.
Well, that's all right. It's the same in my heart.
Okay. As long as you wear the gnome hat, it's all good. So Rosie on the Facebook brought up something that I had actually thought about, and then skipped over in my, addled brain. And she would like to. She was hoping we would talk more about the oral tradition in regards to the repetition of Havamal. And yes, absolutely. I believe that some of the repetition is because it is an oral tradition. It wasn't written down for several hundred years. So a lot of, I don't know what Kinehild's looking for, but clearly it's oral tradition. You can see that in other oral traditions. If you look at Native American culture, there is a repetition in the verses and in the phrases. And that's about all I know about that. So Bersi, you might have more information, but yeah, there is definitely a connection.
Yeah. Repetition definitely helps with memorization. Man, if I could go back in time and ask a skald how composition happens and how memorization happens when you're not writing anything down, and is it rote? Are you just repeating it a lot? I want to know, and unfortunately we don't. But a lot of the other aids in memorization are probably like the alliteration, the really strict metering means that there's a lot less of a chance that you can use the wrong word. Because if you use the wrong word, for instance, that example of a sentence that I gave where instead of using Meitavi, I used fundi. The fundi doesn't have enough syllables, so it just wouldn't work. You would notice a lot of different things. It's actually quite incredible how many things still end up getting swapped out, and different manuscripts have different words or different spellings, and sometimes whole lines get messed up or switched places. But most of the time it's very strict. And so if you're trying to memorize something, just like how rhyming helps, it's easier, I think, to memorize Dr. Seuss than it is to memorize Seamus Heaney. Because Dr. Seuss has more rhyming and like very structured cadences, so you're used to how it feels. And Old Norse poetry, you would get used to, this is how a drop fight feels, this is how Ljóðaháttr feels, things like that. Phonius law.
Yeah, completely agree. And it's Molly, that's a beautiful point. She asks, is there any reason to believe any of these had a tune? I think everybody has a different opinion on that. And my opinion is that probably not a tune as in like a melody, music to go with it, but the structure becomes a tune in itself, if that makes sense. And I'm sure there's some technical word for that I just don't know. But because the meter is usually consistent and you get a flow to it, it's not a tune as what we modernly think of, but the meter does provide a cadence, which would also help with memorization.
So yes. I'm going to jump in really quick. Two things from Old English, one about the repetition and then one about the tune. So the reason I grabbed for this book, which is Old and Middle English, an anthology, is because it's got the Battle of Malden in it. And the Battle of Malden has one of my favorite repetitive phrases. It appears a couple of different times in the poem, and it introduces speeches. And so it's Birchnoth Mathaloda, Bord Hafanoda, and then later it's Birchtwold Hafanoda, Bord Hafaloda. No, Mathaloda, Bord Hafanoda. And what that means is the Birchtwald or Birknoth, whichever one's talking, spoke loudly and raised his shield. And it's this exact same phrase that's used to introduce these speeches. And so you get that repetition, there's some rhyme, and it makes it easy to sort of plug that kind of, he spoke and raised his shield. You can plug that statement in before a speech, and that's a nice, it declares to your audience that something important is about to happen. They've heard the statement before, they know something's coming, they're listening, and it's an easy plug and play bit of poetry that you don't have to come up with. So I think you see that kind of repetition, that structural repetition, or just whole phrases. If you look in the sagas are full of that kind of stuff, where it's just like, so-and-so said, and there's a very standard structure. There's a great example, I think, in Egil's saga, where people are getting insulted, and the insult, he's at the thing and he's going around to the different tents and he's insulting people, or people are insulting, I don't remember which way it goes, but the insults have a very similar structure over and over again. It's the same sort of, like, the way that the conversation goes is mirrored repeatedly. And there's some one thing I read that was talking about, is that how this game worked, is that the lines of the game that everybody kind of knew, or is that just a literary tool to make it easier to remember, or easier to just sort of fill in this bit of the story? So the other part, the other thing I wanted to mention was talking about the song. There's a couple of lines from Maxims 1 that actually kind of talks about this a little bit, and it's Rad shall mon sechan, Runa ritan, leoth yesingen, leophis yernian dom arachen dages onyetan. So what that says is, one should speak counsel, write secrets. Here, runa means secrets. Sing poems. A dear friend must be earned, good repute should be proclaimed, and one should make use of the day, which is actually some really good advice. But it's interesting to me that here poems must be sung. And that is, you see that in singing, right? Like that's a pretty easy to interpret verb, is a verb that gets used talking about poetry. And I'm not sure if it's, we have leftover bits of lyres that we found. And those tend to be earlier than later Anglo-Saxon England, which is probably the origin of this poem. So it may be an archaic holdover. So once upon a time, these poems were accompanied either spoken word or sung with a lyre, and then we just keep the verb singing and apply it to poetry in general. Or it's something more like the using the meter and the rhythm of the poetry, not as song, you're not singing it, but the rhythm gives that motion.
Right. And I think of it more as spoken word. If you think of, they're like Henry Rollins, like he does great spoken word, and part of that is because he keeps a really good meter. And so that's kind of what I think of it as being, but like I said, I don't know.
One last little thing on the song aspect. It is notable that they're using the word sing. I can't think offhand of any time that Hunga or Sunga was used for an Old Norse poem. I know that lots of time we talk about speech and talking, though, in regards to poetry. I mean, even this poem, Havamal, the speech of the High One.
Yeah.
But there is a later set of not poems, but translations of French lays into Old Norse in the court of Hakon Hakonarson of Norway, because he wanted to be a little bit more continental and feel more kingly. So he had all these French lays, for instance, like Bisclere, that's my favorite, it's werewolves, great. All these things translated, these are French court romances from the 12th century. And Strenglekar means, it's streng is string. So it implies this playing of string instruments, which it's unclear whether or not, and of course this is later, this is post-Christianization, we are talking like not the same, by the time Snorri wrote down his the Edda, the prose Edda, the manual to how to write poetry, it's because that kind of poetry was going out of style, and he wanted to make sure that it was preserved.
Yep.
So this is later than these kind of poems are being written. So it's unclear whether or not they're talking about like, this is how we're referring to how we've been performing things in our courts, where you play an instrument, a string instrument while it's happening, or possibly it's referring to how the French are doing things in their courts. Oh, they have these lays, these sort of song type ideas. So even when we look at things that seem very much to imply that there's a musical accompaniment of some sort, it's hard to tell whether or not people were actually doing that in the courts in Norway and Denmark and Sweden and Iceland.
Yeah, I agree. So Kate asked a question: was the idea of a memory castle mentioned in this culture, or consuming the knowledge to make it a part of your being?
So
I've definitely not encountered that for Old Norse. The closest thing is the terms of saying like the seat of memory, or the home of memory, or things like that, referring to, or the home of thoughts, referring to the heart usually.
Right.
I didn't quite know where they were all kept, but definitely no sorts of definitely a consumption of knowledge. We've got the meat of poetry. Consuming dragon hearts gives you like power. It Sigurd just tastes blood off of the dragon heart, and becomes able to understand the speech of birds.
that was something I always found really funny.
Consuming can give you knowledge and power and abilities,
right?
But they never really talk about anything like a mind castle. Kinehild, do you have any?
Yeah, I don't. I was sort of flipping through. I was going to talk about so Old English. We don't unfortunately have this. We don't have any information about, or at least I guess we probably actually no. I could look in Bede. Bede wrote about all sorts of random stuff. He's got a whole treatise on time, and like that's why we have Old English words for minutes and seconds. Is he was basically translating some Latin thing, and he's like, oh, now we have minuten, and that's a word in Old English. Yeah, it's a thing. So he might actually have something, and I just haven't, frankly, dived into Bede's stuff particularly deeply, because poetry, man, epic poetry. But what I was looking for was thinking about poetry and wisdom, and the meat of poetry is an excellent example. I think that's the best example we've got for consuming something that is going to be memory and story and all that kind of stuff. But also, I think there's some imagery in the notion of Odin hanging himself on the tree to acquire runes, because runes do get used in poetry. There's some great examples. I was actually just looking at this morning of Old English poetry, and obviously for people who aren't aware, the Angles, the Saxons, the Utes, the people who would come to speak Old English share a tradition with the Scandinavians of these sort of Germanic gods, and so they have Woden instead of Odin, but it's very similar mythology. So I think the idea of Odin hanging himself on the tree to get the runes is something that they would have been historically familiar with. And so to see that connection between runes and poetry, and I think you can get into some of that. I don't think that answers the memory castle question. I don't think that's really, I think the idea of a memory castle is a much more modern concept. But mnemonics, tools for memory, I think you do see that, examples of it, if not explicit discussion of, in all of this, really any oral poetry or oral storytelling tradition, because we're human and we can't just remember. I mean, I love Beowulf. I love Beowulf. Guys, I really can't describe how, like, driving around Iceland, listening to Seamus Heaney read his translation of Beowulf was like, in my soul. in my soul, you know. So I love that poem so much. But if you ask me to spontaneously give you a section of Beowulf, I can do the beginning, what we Yardanum in Yardagum, right?
Right.
But once we get past that, things really fall apart really, you know, quickly. So I think they had to have some sort of tool. I don't know what that tool was. Besides the repetitive practice from a young age and the repetitive structure.
No, yeah, agreed. Well, and with that, do we have any last comments? We are pretty much, you know, we've been rambling on for almost an hour. I'm sure our audience is either getting bored or, you know, has to pee or something.
Now than there was at the beginning. They're enjoying this. Let's keep talking.
That's fair. Word of Old Norse poetry? Impossible.
It could happen, Bersi. It could happen. But go ahead. Did you have something?
I was going to say, what are we doing next time?
Yeah. What we're doing next time is another of the short tales, the short stories, the Pater. No, I mispronounced that. Pater. Anyway, we're gonna do
Pater, yeah.
Pater, yeah. Awin of the Westboards, otherwise known as "What Are You Doing with That Polar Bear?" And for that one, we are actually, if all goes well, we are going to pre-record different chapters of it and release those so that people can, at their leisure, listen to it, and then we can, you know, nerd out about the story itself and what it means and what was going on. So we are moving to, or we have moved to a every 2 weeks format. So that will be June 13th, same time, same channel. And in the meantime, this recording will be up probably in the next couple of days on YouTube, and I'll post the link back into the event so that everybody that missed it could find it. But if you're listening to me, you know that that's, never mind. Talking to myself now. Anyway, any last words for our dwindling audience? I need a gnome hat. I'm going to make myself a gnome hat. That'll happen.
I'm impressed with the state on my head this whole time.
And with that, we are going to see you guys in 2 weeks.
Bye.